The Day Eddie Met the Author by Louise Borden. Illustrated by Will Terry. Tuesday, October 10th was going to be a great day for Eddie and his class. It was the day a real author was coming to Riverside Elementary School. Eddie had been waiting. The whole school had been waiting, especially Eddie's teacher, Mrs. Morrow. She loved real authors. She loved how real authors made the words flow and how the words sounded just right and went with pictures in their own way. Mrs. Morrow said she couldn't live without books and the wonderful stories in them. She said third graders had their own stories to tell. We are all authors with important stories inside us. Eddie chewed on his pencil and thought hard. How could his stories ever be like a real author's? Eddie had been reading. His whole class had been reading 10 different books by the author who was coming to visit. In every one of those books, Eddie found a part that seemed just for him. Everyone in the class found their own parts in the books, too. How does the author do that? Eddie asked Mrs. Morrow one morning as the bell rang for recess. That's a great question, Eddie, his teacher said. You'll have to ask her when she comes. Eddie wrote down his author question on a bright yellow piece of paper and put it in his desk, right on top of his ideas to write about notebook. That's a question you won't want to lose, Mrs. Morrow told him with her best smile. Eddie Lewis, Grade 3. How do you write books that have parts meant for me? At last, the big day. Mrs. Morrow wrote Tuesday, October 10th on the chalkboard in her best cursive. Mrs. Morrow led her class into the gym. There was the real author. She was testing Mr. Ciccarella's microphone and getting ready for the assembly. Arthur was setting up chairs for the teachers. Eddie checked out the author from head to foot. He thought real authors would look different from everybody else. This author just looked like a teacher or a mom. Eddie sat between two of his classmates and he sat up straight. The author was wearing a vest that was a patchwork of pictures from some of her books. Eddie looked to find his favorite one. There it was. There were whispers in the audience. Then Mr. Ciccarella welcomed their special guest. No one in Mrs. Morrow's class talked or squirmed, not even Tyler Mason. Everyone was ready to listen, and the author began. I can tell you've all had your noses in my books. I've been reading your wonderful writing in the school hallways and seen your terrific illustrations. Eddie sat up straighter. He was so proud of Riverside Elementary. Some of you may be wondering how to become a writer. The best way to become a writer is to be a reader. Eddie was a reader. The author was talking about him. The minutes of the assembly zoomed by. Eddie never wanted it to end. Today he felt like a real writer. Finally, it was time for questions and answers. Eddie put his hand up, fast as lightning. But there were other hands in front of him and behind him and on both sides. Everyone wanted the author to call on them. Eddie waved his yellow paper in the air. His question was important. Mrs. Morrow had said it was not a question to lose. How long have you been a writer? How old are you? Have you autographed our books yet? Which book is your favorite book? Do you ever run out of ideas? How old are your kids? Which book was the hardest to write? No one asked the question that Eddie wanted answered, but the assembly was over, and Eddie hadn't been called on. Mr. Ciccarella began to dismiss the second and third graders. Eddie's question! His important question on the most exciting day of the school year? He wanted to know the answer. Eddie read the words he had written on his yellow paper. Slowly, Eddie folded up his question and put it back in his pocket. Suddenly, he felt a grown-up's hand on his shoulder. But it wasn't Mrs. Morrow or Mr. Ciccarella. It was the author. She was standing right next to Eddie in the third grade line, asking him his name. Then she said, "I saw your hand up in the assembly, waving a yellow paper. I knew you had an important question to ask, but we ran out of time." The third graders began to crowd around Eddie and the author. Mrs. Morrow shushed everyone as the author unfolded the yellow paper and read Eddie's words out loud. "Now that is a thinking question, Eddie," the author said. Her smile was like a big, warm hug. Eddie felt as tall as a grown-up standing in his third grade line. Everyone was quiet while the author put her hand on her chin and thought about Eddie's question. Maybe everyone was thinking about the parts of the author's books that seemed like they were meant just for them. That's what Eddie was thinking about. Then the author said, "Eddie, if you write about parts of yourself, I bet your reader will have some of those parts too. I guess that's a small answer to the big question you asked. And by the way, I've always loved the name Eddie. Someday I may use it when I'm writing a book." Eddie looked at Mrs. Morrow and gave her a wide smile. Now maybe his stories could be like the author's, and he would try to write from his heart. On the afternoon of Tuesday, October 10th, Eddie began a rough draft of a new story during Mrs. Morrow's writing workshop. He didn't know how it would end, but he had plenty to write about from what had happened that day. He already knew a title to use. He'd written it in his notebook as soon as he got back to the classroom. The Day I Met the Author by Eddie Lewis, Grade 3.
Stone Soup, retold and illustrated by John J. Muth.